Anne-Marie Engtoft Larsen is the ambassador of the country of Denmark to Silicon Valley, and she is the second person in that role. Her predecessor, Casper Kling, got snapped up by Microsoft and is now head of policy in Europe for Microsoft. And he's a good friend of Techonomy's who's been at our sessions also, and probably will be at a session in the relatively near future, also to help us understand what's happening with European tech regulation. I am still seeing, I think Caitlin's audio might still be on or something. Is everybody else seeing Caitlin large as a, and not, well, maybe I'm just looking at it wrong. Okay. I switched to gallery view and now everything's fine. The travails of Zoom conferencing. Anyway, Anne-Marie, thank you so much for being here. I want you to tell us, to start out by explaining, and I should say you previously were at the World Economic Forum, you've been in government before. At the World Economic Forum, you oversaw the work, the very important work they've been doing for the last few years on the fourth industrial revolution. So that put you in a very good stead for this job, because your remit is very, very broad, as I think we're going to hear. Why does Denmark have a tech ambassador, and what do you want to do in that role, which you have recently assumed?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, David, for the invitation. And I gotta say, this is the first time I've ever started a Zoom conference with a 5-minute yoga, and I loved it. So, you know, cheers to much more of that in any Zoom conferences. And it's a great pleasure to be here with Techonomy and speaking about techplomacy. So why does Denmark has a tech ambassador? The main argument for this is that technology has never played a bigger role in our lives. It is practically the first thing we see in the morning when we get up, and it is for many of us also the last thing we see before we go to bed. It is encompassing everything, whether it is our family values, whether it's our society, our communities, our financial markets, our economies, our workplace. Everything has been, you know, incredibly shaped, driven by emerging technologies. And we believe that, you know, technologies, they play a potential crucial fix to many of the big problems we have. Inclusive and sustainable, you know, inclusive healthcare for everyone, a sustainable future addressing climate change, mitigating kind of the worst disasters on that, environmental protection, to questions around inclusivity, education for all. Technology really holds a key to many of that, but it is also one where we've, over the past couple of years, has seen the shadow sides. We've seen cyber attacks, disinformation. I mean, we've been living through a pandemic, yet the sentiment against vaccines has never been bigger. That is also part of what's happening when we see the negative sides of technology, not to talk about authoritarian surveillance, et cetera. And so we believe that today a lot of power is really concentrated in the hands of very few. And for a country like Denmark, it is often concentrated in the hands of very few people that sit very far away and that don't necessarily understand Danish way of life, Danish traditions, values, and interests. So what we've been doing as diplomats for 250 years is being where power is, being where transformation is, being where change is taking place. We try to insert and apply Danish values, Danish interests, engage in negotiations, relationship, collaborations, and building bridges to ensure that the technological development taking place often halfway across the globe is also benefiting and ultimately delivering on some of those societal expectations, hopes, addressing the concerns of Danish citizens. And so the role that I have, and very delighted to be having, is with a global mandate. It is really to be representing the Danish government, Danish citizens, and Danish industry and community at large to the global tech industry, insisting that we are at a crucial point in time. I think 5 to 10 years ago, the pendulum was more optimistic. We were seeing technologies with much more optimism. When we talked about the negative sides, it was often in terms of robots were going to, you know, take our jobs. And that was really the only, I think, kind of major discussion negatively. But here, fast forward 5, 6 years now, the pendulum has swung. I think we're in a place now where we see much more concerns about the role of technology for our democratic elections, our citizen and public dialogue, the way that it affects our children and youth. And if we are to get that pendulum to not be too pessimistic, but a place where we address it realistically, where we say there's immense opportunities that we need to harness, but there are also shadow sides that we need to address. It requires a collaboration between government and industry. It requires building bridges. It requires trying to understand each other, and then it requires us to find common ground, shared solutions. So that is in short what my role is here.
Okay, you have a very big mandate. I mean, your role, you have a set of KPIs your government gave you recently, which ranges from helping develop Danish industry to addressing cybersecurity, to helping tech integrate better with NATO, to defending democracy, fighting disinformation. All these things are on your plate, and that is really good. I wanted to also mention regarding what you just said about the change in tone. I'm not sure you knew, but yesterday our closing speaker is the author of a book called Monster. Monster being his word with his co-author for the entire aggregation of tech that surrounds us that has taken control against our will, and how we can step up and assert our control over it again. And you should check that book out. And as an attendee, of course, as a speaker, you can get a copy of it. They have draconian proposals. They not only do they want to eliminate Section 230 in the US, they want to have a license to use social media only for people over 18. They want to ban all political advertising on social media, and a number of other quite strident, not to mention a data authority in the United States, a technology administration that's this is US centric, but many of them apply in other countries as well. But pertinent to that, excuse me, in a document that you guys sent me about your work, the headline is Democratic governments in the driver's seat of technological development. Now, that is a high aspiration in itself. Is that what we ought to seek, that democratic governments should be in the driver's seat, as clearly our speaker yesterday believes?
I think absolutely yes. I think that the information asymmetry that we've been seeing between big tech and governments has also now become a power asymmetry. And if citizens are to trust the technological revolution, and I think that the key here is trust. If we don't trust the technological revolution, if we don't feel an agency, if we don't feel empowered to partake in it, all the wonders, all the things that we dream about, all the things that sci-fi books that imagined a better life, a more meaningful life, more freedom. I mean, the early pioneers of the internet were thinking around the lines of Tocqueville and what can we do with a more thriving civil society? If we are to harness them, that requires citizens. And that's where we as governments speak on behalf of citizens to feel more in control, to be part of setting the direction, to feel more engaged. And basically, it is about participating. And this is not enough just being, I think, consuming these technologies. It also feels about an agency in shaping them, in leading them, directing them, and then about setting the guardrails. Right now, there is way too much data harvested on individuals. That data is often used in these, attention-seeking economies. And I think it consumes us to a degree that it's not necessarily healthy for neither the individual nor the community. We've been discussing how our democratic dialogue, and that's not just about our elections, but that's about the public conversation, citizens engaging in discussions, trying to understand one another, trying to get closer to one another. If we do not design platforms, ways to interact online, that is fundamentally trying to support those objectives rather than simply selling us more goods and stuff, we're not going to get the ideal outcome. So I think now about governments, it's really about stepping up to the responsibility that we as government have. And I think that's why we're seeing the new Biden administration, we're seeing a European leadership, we're also seeing it from the Danish government, and a number of governments around the world are saying, we want technology to play a major role in our lives because it's giving us a lot of positive things. I think looking back at the last 12 months, I wouldn't have been wanting to go through that without technology. But we need to make sure that it fundamentally supports democratic values, that it is inclusive, that it is just, that it's fair, and that it delivers on our societal expectations and the values of our society. And that's why I think government, this now, famous Madeleine Albright quote, we've been for a long time, we've been trying to govern 21st century technologies with the mindset of the 20th century and with the institutions of the 19th. And that is probably not going to get us very far. So I think just as we're seeing a technological revolution, this is also a revolution for us as bureaucracies and governments, trying to find new agile ways of making sure that we get the best possible outcome, because regulations should never be a straitjacket. It is not about minimizing innovation. On the contrary, it's about setting the vision for what we want to see innovation basically delivering to society. It's about setting aspirational goals. And I think it's also about, being a bit more ambitious. We could live better lives, freer lives, more sustainable lives, more meaningful lives, if we allow ourselves to be slightly more creative and imaginary in terms of what can we use the technology for, and then how do we design it so that it delivers on that.
Yeah, your work with Fourth Industrial Revolution really positions you to understand these things at the right level. I love the way you're talking, but this really is almost about redesigning society to kind of deal with the fact that we let, as our author yesterday described, so much happen unwillingly, unwittingly at the behest of corporations. The society needs to regain control, which I love that you're saying that. And I also love that your argument, democratic governments are great. But what about the fact that there's so many non-democratic governments who are also so interested in technology, in many cases in order to retain power, to repress public opinion, et cetera. And they also want a seat at the table for defining the landscape. How will a diplomat like yourself think about that? Because ultimately your work is going to have to lead in that direction too.
Absolutely. I think, first of all, 40 years ago, 25% of the world's countries were democracies. Today, that is 60%. We are still seeing a flourishing democratic movement. And at the same time now, I think some of the more traditional and longstanding democracies, we're also seeing, I think, maybe waking up and saying, hey, did we not focus enough on our own democracies? If we are to advocate and support democratic values and democratic movements across the world, we need to make sure that we're doing our utmost to flourish, to nourish, and to maintain our own, because democracy is not a checkbox exercise. It's not once you have democracy, you will have it forever. You constantly need to work for your democracy. You need to nourish it. You need to make sure that it flourishes and that it has all the right, ability to build itself much stronger in whatever context it finds itself in. So where we're working now, this is really to work with like-minded countries, other democracies, but also civil society across the world, and ensuring that our technological revolution fundamentally needs to support that. And that's where a lot of our efforts is really looking at. So whether it's on the transatlantic collaboration between the European Union and the new Biden administration, which we're very much devoted to, but also engaging with countries around the world. Because there's no question that technology has become high politics. Look at the conversations around 5G, quantum computing, AI. Whoever is winning that race is going to win a much larger race. And that's why we're insisting both in building capabilities in Europe, stronger alliances with our like-minded partners, building our stronger, thriving civil societies around it, and then finally also insisting on a dialogue, even when it's hard at sometimes.
Yeah, what's interesting, all of you, you're saying something that has come up at least twice already today, and your very function, the role you have underscores this idea that we need a whole of society approach to address the challenges before us. This came up regarding extremism in our first session, regarding connectivity and getting to the Sustainable Development Goals in the second session, which is, and connecting the world is another key whole of society challenge, and you're talking about it at a similar level. But what do we, yes, you can work with democratic countries, you can work cross, multidisciplinary with NGOs and business, and they are stepping up, and that's great. But how do you look at something, for example, like the US-China tech competition that is getting so almost vicious at the moment?
Look, I think the kind of geopolitical rivalry that we've seen particularly between the US and China, it leaves very little room for the rest of the world. And right now, there's been a lot of, there are two ways to opt into a technological system. I think we need to find one that is also maybe taking a bit of a different approach. And that's where European legislation for a long time has come in when we talk about the citizen approach first, in terms of, instead of the kind of authoritarian state approach or the very market-driven approach that we see here in the US. So I think, first of all, by creating various ways of thinking, engaging, developing technological systems, that is one piece. Secondly, my role as a diplomat is to try to insist on the conversations and building bridges even when it's hard. If we simply close ourselves and just try to protect whatever is within our own borders and make the best optimal outcome, I think we're going to miss the point of that there's need for global governance on a lot of these issues. That's why I have a small office in Beijing, which is also working with the industry and the government there. But I do believe at the same time, we find a immense pool of shared values between Europe and North America. And I think some of the conversations we've been seeing around antitrust, around cybersecurity, even around data flows currently, there is a stronger and stronger shared value pool, and also a commitment to finding solutions on this together across the Atlantic, and then extend that and build that to many of the democracies that we see across the world. I mean, we have very strong relationship and ties to India, Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, across the world. We're seeing a lot of countries, I think, basically striving for the same and saying we need to have a technological development that is supporting our societal values, our way of life, our citizens, while at the same time, really harvesting and I think harnessing these amazing opportunities.
Yeah, it's interesting. Americans think we have the best values, but there actually is something to be said for Danish values. It really is very healthy that your country was the first one that had an ambassador in your area, and that is speaking out so much beyond its small size in impacting these issues. It's good. I want to go to one of the questions because we have a very knowledgeable audience member, Michael Nelson of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'm just going to read his question. Governments are struggling to find clear policies for the digital society because different agencies have different goals. Take encryption. Privacy commissioners and agencies working on cybersecurity want strong end-to-end encryption, but the Interior Ministry and intelligence agencies hate that. How can we get prime ministers to break the policy logjam in this and many other areas, or maybe others than prime ministers? But how can that kind of, those are both areas that you're involved in. How do we get agreement on things like that? Great question, Michael.
I mean, that's an amazing question. Thank you so much, Michael. Look, what we're trying to do from a Danish perspective and the way that we address this is by, first of all, getting a much more holistic approach to understanding technologies, regulating technologies, and finding the priorities around technologies from a national level. And I think for too often, we see with so much whatever is happening, whether it's on technology or other things often happen in silos until we realize that we need a much more holistic, integrated approach. And it's the same when it comes to this question on encryption. It's the same. Often we need to balance and triangulate between, if not opposing forces, at least something that's hard to recognize, between how much do we maintain in terms of security versus the freedom of the individual. When we talk about freedom of speech, it's some of the same challenges that we see, how much to balance the security concern versus a strong commitment to freedom of speech, and how do we do that in a regulatory way. So just to say, there are no easy answers. I think at first is to come and find a shared understanding across governments, addressing the various perspectives and ways in that we come with this, insisting on a conversation across those silos, and then trying to see the larger perspective. Often we try to take this piecemeal approach to technology regulation. It's the same thing now. We've been discussing antitrust for a long time, and antitrust have almost become this panacea in solving all our democratic problems. I don't think antitrust in and of itself will necessarily solve the problems that we have with our democracy in the digital age. And sometimes there might even be opposing forces in that. But it requires us and it forces us to come into a conversation on, so what are all these pieces that we need to look at? How do we design it and integrate it in the right way? And then at the same time, having the North Star. I think for too long, we've been lacking asking the fundamental question of what do we want to get out of technology? What is a technological vision for us? What are the aims that it ultimately needs to serve? And then having that North Star be a guiding way for us to then find common ground on some of these thornier issues.
Our next session is about business and how business needs to step up even on issues like democracy, much more forcefully than it has. Do you see in your work in attempting to build multi-stakeholder coalitions in coming out of the World Economic Forum, where it was such a big part? Do you think business's attitude is shifting fundamentally around the issues that you care about?
Absolutely. It's my, at least it's my experience here that first of all, Silicon Valley reads the newspapers as well. They're very concerning and quite hard articles almost every day that really goes to challenge a lot of the business models, a lot of the way that the tech business is operating. And I do see a shift. And I think that pressure it's been putting on tech companies is what they're now responding to. And that's why, as a representative for Denmark, we've been quite, I think, successful so far in having an engagement, a conversation, a dialogue with industry. The question of whether to regulate or not, that is no longer the question. It's about how do we regulate? And as I see it, industry is recognizing that and is inviting into a closer collaboration. And you hear more and more, tech executives say, we need to be regulated. And where we, as a Danish approach to this, we really believe in a kind of light but right approach to regulation. We also believe in the multi-stakeholder partnership, because if we go around regulating without consulting, understanding, and finding a deeper relationship with industry, we're going to end up with the wrong regulation. We're going to try to solve an issue that is really something that we got to be looking much more into the future to. Just like right now, trying to regulate a sector that we probably haven't really regulated for 2 decades. And now we're trying to sort of patch up and kind of do a bit of damage control. And rather than doing that continuously, we need to have stronger public-private partnerships. But I just want to say with that, my experience at the World Economic Forum, it is hard. If you find a public-private partnership to be easy to do, engage in, is probably not a very ambitious one. Recognizing that they're hard, they're different interests, and it requires us all to lean in a little bit. I think it's a fundamental first principle. Building trust around that shared mission is what we're really trying to do.
Just got a couple minutes left, so this is the final question. I believe you told me roughly 35 other countries now have followed in Denmark's wake and have, if not a formal ambassador in most cases, some kind of a foreign ministry level person who's really thinking about this at a much more sophisticated level than in the past. At the same time, there have been calls for much more global cooperation and global discussions on many of these matters. Brad Smith of Microsoft has called for a Cyber Geneva Convention on cybersecurity in particular, but there also have been calls, and I personally have made this call, that the nations of the world need to just get together and start talking about the technologized landscape and a variety of issues. The World Summit on the Information Society is not taking it far enough. Do you see any movement in that direction?
Absolutely. I saw actually, and even today, just to mention, I saw a number of tech companies were out and asking the G7 to do the exact same thing. Look, we're definitely seeing various movements in this direction. The new proposed EU-US Tech and Trade Council is a first initialization of that, of a stronger transatlantic cooperation for that. And what we're doing with this network now of about 30 to 35 tech diplomats such as myself is trying to do exactly that. It is starting that conversation, understanding on a policy level what needs to be done, how can we work together in this endeavor, and getting a shared understanding. Because to many, whether it's governments or diplomats like myself, this is a new endeavor. We cannot just simply use the toolbox of the diplomats to solve all of these issues. This is going to require new ways of doing it, probably new legislation, but also new mindsets. And so what we're doing, I think, seeing the contours of now is a willingness. It's I think, a commitment to actually start doing that. And then having it trickle, some of it will have to be multilaterally done. And that's why we're still very active in the European Union, obviously, with the UN, various agencies, but also in getting a group of committed countries together who are willing to step up the ambition, the action, take a leadership. And that's why Denmark has a tech embassy and a tech ambassador is exactly to do that. We're such a small, open economy. We know the value of strong relationships with the world, of integrating us into the world. We've seen the very positive aspects of globalization. If we are to continue that, and if we are to at the same time protect and promote human rights, protect and promote our democracies, build a stronger, fairer, more just, sustainable world, it requires an unprecedented level of collaboration.
Wow. Well, thank you. We at Techonomy have been huge supporters of the work of Denmark ever since Casper first got this role, and we want to continue to work with you. We're really grateful that you were able to join us today. So thank you, Anne-Marie, and we hope to stay in close touch.
Thank you so much.